Welcome to the One-Year Book of Mormon. A non-Mormon reads through the Book of Mormon. 2 Nephi 25. Chapter Overview. After quoting 13 full chapters of Isaiah in full, Nephi doesn't even begin to exegete what he has written, but instead says, I told my kids orally about this, and now I'm going to write my own prophecy. Really? So Isaiah speaks clearly about things if you have the spirit of prophecy, and Nephi has the spirit of prophecy so that he understands these things, but then he can't explain the passages of Isaiah so that everybody can understand them. That doesn't make sense. Verse 10 says that the destruction of Jerusalem happened immediately after my father left Jerusalem. I can grant a sort of delayed immediately, so that we're not talking about a matter of days between the exit of Lehi and the destruction. Indeed, there were 2 expeditions back to Jerusalem afterwards, with the first one at least taking so long that Sariah feared that all of her sons were dead. So this time must have lasted at least several weeks. But the Bible records that it was a decade or so between the first year of Zedekiah and the destruction of Jerusalem. And remember, Lehi left Jerusalem in the first year of Zedekiah. So this is far from immediate, at least 10 years. If one looks back over the course of centuries or even millennia, then one could be excused for thinking of a space of 10 years out of 1,000 as being more or less immediate. But Nephi is supposedly writing this about 40 years after leaving and about 30 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. This would be akin to saying in our day something about President Reagan being inaugurated, which happened in 1981, and then immediately afterwards, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, which was in 1991, after 8 years of Reagan's presidency, and then partway through the Bush presidency of the first President Bush. Verse 12 includes the phrase, wars and rumors of wars, which seems to be a favorite phrase of Joseph Smith, occurring 6 times in the Book of Mormon, once in the Doctrines and Covenants, and twice in the Pearl of Great Price. By contrast, it occurs only twice in the entire Bible, which is in a parallel passage of Matthew and Mark, so was said only once by Jesus. Another favorite phrase seems to be wars and contentions, which occurs even more often than wars and rumors of wars. It's 28 times in the Book of Mormon itself. Verse 13 anachronistically uses the term crucify to speak of how the Messiah will die, then uses the phrase healing in his wings, which occurs in the Bible in Malachi, supposedly written some 200 years after the time of Nephi. Verse 16 and 19 oddly speak of the future Jews living many generations after those who rejected Jesus as believing in false messiahs, but would come to believe in the true Messiah, with verse 18 saying clearly that the prophets speak of only one Messiah. I say this because I've seen some Mormons bring up that some Jewish people believe that there were multiple messiahs, and it was brought up in such a way as to make it sound like the Mormon was almost agreeing with this idea. So if it should happen again, we need to remember that the Book of Mormon forbids such a view and hold the Mormons to a consistent view. Verse 19 also presents Jesus Christ as a name. His name shall be Jesus Christ, rather than what that actually is, a name, Jesus, and a title, the Christ or the Messiah. Of course, the very presence of the word Christ is anachronistic, since it's the English transliteration of the Greek word Christus, which is the translation of the Hebrew word Messiah or Mashiach, both of which mean anointed. So it's like saying Jesus anointed as if anointed was his last name. Verse 20 oddly says that Moses healed the nations, plural, after they had been bitten by the fiery serpents, though only the nation singular of Israel experienced the healing. Verse 21 speaks of a promise given to the biblical Joseph, but of course no such promise was ever made in the Bible. However, the Book of Mormon has several things like this. Things claimed to be revelations that God gave to Joseph or other Old Testament people that are nowhere said or even hinted at in the Bible. Verse 23 is the famous verse that says, "For we know that it is by grace that we are saved, after all that we can do." I like the succinct rebuttal that the Bible message is, it is by grace that we are saved after all that we have done. It's also a little weird that Nephi starts using we rather than I, though I must admit it's a nice change from the repetitive I, Nephi. Verse 24 and following are an odd mishmash of modern Christianity and pretend Old Testament Judaism, and one can scarcely make heads or tails of it. Although verse 24 particularly says, we keep the law of Moses, though remember, they don't. They have non-Levitical, non-Aaronic priests, and they sacrifice outside of Jerusalem. And so far, other than proclaiming that they keep the law, there is no indication that they actually do. For example, they haven't talked about circumcising their sons or resting on the Sabbath, anything like that. Though it's possible later on in the Book of Mormon they'll say more, but I haven't gotten to it yet. And I'm in Mosiah 3 right now. Verse 25 says that the law has become dead unto us, which makes no sense, since the law isn't dead until Jesus actually dies, which is some 500 or 600 years in the future from when this supposedly took place. I know. Mormons will say, well, it was so certain to Nephi and his offspring that it would happen, they could live in light of its fulfillment. But it really makes no biblical sense. Verse 30 says, inasmuch as it shall be expedient, ye must keep the performances and ordinances of God until the law shall be fulfilled, which was given unto Moses. The Mormon will point to this as the basis for why they can sacrifice outside of Jerusalem via non-Aaronic priests. It wasn't expedient, since they were so far removed from Jerusalem, and God didn't send Levites or descendants of Aaron with Nephi's family. But of course, in the law of Moses, as we see it in the Bible, God doesn't tell them, keep whatever of these laws you find easy to keep, and ignore the rest. Instead, he says, keep all of these laws and live, fail to keep them and die. Only the death of Christ has freed us from the law which man cannot keep, and at the time this was supposedly written, the death of Christ was at least 500 years into the future.